Any kids up to third grade that haven't already headed downstairs for childcare, you're welcome to do so at this point. And for the rest of us, let's get our Bibles out and turn back to Matthew chapter 5, that portion that Larry read for us just a few moments ago. Telling the truth and sticking to your word seem like such basic concepts, don't they? I appreciate the story David was just sharing about, as a kid, it was like, oh man, I want to tell the truth. And just in case I forgot and I didn't actually play outside like I thought I was, I'll say, if I remember correctly. It's when it actually comes down to the navigation of human relationships, we find in practice that sticking to your word or even just being completely honest are a struggle from time to time. Let me give you an example, a situation that some of you might be able to relate to. Some friends invite you to an event and you don't really feel like going because you've had a long week and you just want some quiet downtime for the weekend. However, you don't have a legitimate excuse to say no. You don't really have anything else going on this weekend. And it feels rude to just say, no, I don't really want to go. Don't really value your company that much. That's what it kind of feels like you're saying, right? What do? Well, if you're concerned about lying, but you're also at the same time a people pleaser like me, you have to come up with some kind of non-committal answer that's somewhere between a lie and a truthful answer, right? It's not really a lie, but you're not really telling them your true intentions. It makes me think of that character Pinocchio in the movie Shrek the Third. The bad guy is searching for Shrek, the main character, who's hiding from him, and he finds Pinocchio, and here's what happens.
You can't lie. So tell me, puppet, where is Shrek?
I don't know where he's not.
You're telling me you don't know where Shrek is?
It wouldn't be inaccurate to assume that I couldn't exactly not say that is or isn't almost partially incorrect.
So you do know where he is?
On the contrary, I'm possibly more or less not definitely rejecting the idea that in no way, with any amount of uncertainty, that I undeniably do or do not know where he should and probably be. If that indeed wasn't where he isn't, even if he wasn't not where I knew he was, could mean that I wouldn't not know where he was.
Enough! Shrek went off to bring back the next heir! Oh!
A little bit like what David was describing he was doing as a kid, right? Perhaps some of you can relate. Have you ever given an answer quite like that? Today, we are looking at Jesus' instructions in the Sermon on the Mount about promises, using this language of swearing oaths, making a promise by swearing an oath, appealing to some kind of higher authority to add weight to your promise. And we're going to see how life in the kingdom of heaven, the life that Jesus calls his followers to live, is a life that is lived in such a way that promises actually aren't even required. That all that is required is a simple yes or no. We never need to have a reason to appeal to something other than our word in order to assure someone that we truly mean what we say when we say yes or no. That's what Jesus is getting at here. It's a passage that's not so much about what we're supposed to or not supposed to say. It's really a passage about how we are supposed to live. That our living backs up our word. Our living backs up what we say. let's dig into this passage and look at Jesus' teaching here together. As he has been doing the past few weeks, we've been looking at these antitheses in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, you've heard it said this, but I say to you this. And he's been in this pattern for a good portion of Matthew 5 here, of kind of unpacking, okay, here are some Old Testament laws that you are familiar with, speaking to these Jewish people that he's preaching to. You're familiar with these laws, but I want to get to the heart of these things and unpack what does God really want? What is this law pointing toward in terms of a life lived out for him? What does life in the kingdom really look like? And so today he gets to this passage again. You have heard it was said to those of old, starting out with that same formula, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. So once again, here's the pattern. He starts off with, what does the law say? And then he's going to get into, here's what I say. What does the law require? It requires, first of all, that you don't swear falsely. Now, I think the NIV used a little different terminology there, saying something more like you shouldn't go back on your oath or something like that. Do not break your oath. I think that swearing falsely is a little more literal translation here of what Jesus is getting at here, because what he's doing is he's quoting from Deuteronomy 19:12. And that Deuteronomy 19:12 is set in this context of all these commands to the people in the way that they treat each other. Okay? So it's the section that says, don't lie to your neighbor, don't swear falsely, kind of the idea of making promises falsely. And it ends with verse 18, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's not Jesus is going to get to that later in his Sermon on the Mount, but that command to love your neighbor as yourself has been around ever since Deuteronomy 19. And that's the context in which the first half of what Jesus is quoting here is set. It's set in the context of human relationships. And so, in that context, swearing falsely has to do with promising something without any intention of following through on it. Right? It's like I swear to you that I will plow this field for you, right? You're making a deal with your neighbor, and then it's like, I'm not really going to do it. I just wanted him to pay me so I could run away, right? Something like that. Swearing falsely is a big deal in the Old Testament, and Jesus points to it here. Proverbs 26 talks about this dynamic of misleading your neighbor and then kind of playing it off as a joke. You lie to your neighbor, and then it's like, oh, wasn't I just joking? Proverbs 26, verses 18 to 19 talk about that. And so there's all kinds of different ways in which we might swear falsely, misleading people, telling them one thing, but we don't really mean it, or promising something that we don't really intend to fulfill. And so the law, even back from Deuteronomy, said, don't do this. You shouldn't treat each other that way. But it's interesting what Jesus does here. He summarizes not just that law, but he puts together with it other teaching on fulfilling oaths to the Lord. And you can see what he says there in verse 33. You've heard it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely. That's Deuteronomy 19. But shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. So with the second part, Jesus is just kind of combining together Old Testament law on lying to each other and then also lying to God. You shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. You are supposed to fulfill your oaths. Now, Jesus, with that second part, you shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn, that is sort of a summary of a bunch of different Old Testament teachings. You find it in Numbers chapter 30, in Deuteronomy 23, Ecclesiastes 5, many different places where God said, don't swear an oath to me, don't make a promise to me, don't commit something to the Lord unless you really intend to follow through on it. And this was something that people could do in Judaism with, it was sort of a voluntary thing. You might remember there's this thing called the Nazirite vow. Samson was one of those guys that had the Nazirite vow. That was a voluntary committing of yourself to the Lord for a period of time, and there were rules associated with it, like you couldn't cut your hair, you couldn't eat certain kinds of things, and all of that. And so that would be an example of a vow that somebody might swear to the Lord, saying, I'm going to commit myself more totally to you for this period of time. And God says, if you do that, you better follow through with it. I'm not going to let you off the hook because, well, it kind of got tough and I just didn't feel like it anymore or whatever. You better fulfill it. And so if it's wrong to make promises to your neighbor, in the context of Deuteronomy 19, the first thing that Jesus was quoting there, if it's wrong to make promises to your neighbor that you don't intend to keep, how much more serious is it to make promises to God and then go back on it? Right? This is a big, big deal. Both in relationships with fellow Israelites and in their relationship to God, the law consistently instructed Israel to keep the promises that they'd made. And Jesus, as he has already done with a few other Old Testament laws like we've seen, he highlights this teaching, but then he wants to expand it and get to the heart of it. What is God looking for, really, in these instructions about keeping your oath? Jesus outlines what the law said, and then he says, but I say to you, verse 34, do not take an oath at all. Either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. So what does Jesus say here? What is Jesus' requirement? Don't swear an oath at all. Once again, we find here Jesus' instructions are absolute. We heard this, back when he was talking about lust or divorce and things like or anger. Very hard line, very sort of absolute instructions. Why? Well, what does an oath do? I think that's what Jesus is getting at here. What does an oath do? On the one hand, it can be to add weight to your promise. So you're invoking something that you care about greatly in order to show how greatly you care about this promise. Right? Like you're adding weight to it. It's like, I promise you, but I swear on my mother's grave. Right? It's like I loved my mother so much and I don't want to dishonor her memory, and so I'm promising based on my love of my mother that, and it's adding weight to what I'm saying. So you can be even more sure that I will follow through. There's another sense in which swearing an oath can be taken here. It can be seen to invoke a divinity. Like you're invoking God as a witness or even as a participant in some way in the fulfillment of your promise. It's kind of like you're dragging God into it. I swear on the Lord that I will do this. And this is some of the ways that oaths were used back then. We might use the term nowadays as God is my witness, right? It's sort of like, God will back me up on this. I will come through. And so you're sort of you're calling in as support to your promise. You're calling in the honor of the God that you serve. In other words, swearing an oath implies whether you're adding weight to your promise through swearing an oath on something you care about, or adding weight to your promise by calling God to serve as witness or even to participate in the fulfilling of that oath, the implication, either way, is that my word is not enough to bind my actions. There's some uncertainty about whether or not I'm actually going to do what I say, and therefore I need to add weight to what I say so that there's a better certainty that I will follow through. Does that make sense? So this is what oaths do. This is why Jesus is so absolute about it. Don't swear an oath at all. There's another reason why this is so inappropriate. Not just the implication that my word is not enough, that I'm not an honest enough person to actually follow through, but there's another implication here. Anything that you swear by or swear on isn't really yours anyway to swear on. This is what Jesus gets into here. He's very logical in this. He says, don't take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God. So you don't own heaven. It's not yours to promise, right? And so you have no say in what happens with heaven. So don't swear by heaven. It's not yours. Nor by earth, for it is his footstool. Even earth belongs to God. You can't swear by the earth. You don't own that either. And then the person might think, well, I can at least swear on myself, right? My own head. Jesus says, no, don't even swear by your own head. For you cannot make one hair white or black. Now, there might be some hairstylists here that say, Pastor, I can do a lot of different colors to your hair. So, and obviously that we know that's not what Jesus is talking about here, right? He's talking about actually naturally changing the color of the follicles of your hair. You have no control even over your own, your own head. And so don't even take an oath by your own head. It doesn't ultimately really belong to you. God is still sovereign over whether your hair is white or black, whether you live or die today. And so I think of it this way. It's like all you're appealing to something else to add weight to your promise is like trying to take out a home equity loan on somebody else's house. It's like you don't own that. You can't get the loan, right? All you have is your word. And that's what you need to stand on. That's what Jesus gets to in verse 37 there. We don't have the authority to invoke God's name or his stuff, heaven or earth or my head or whatever. We don't have the authority to invoke those things to lend weight to our promises, but the solution is we are to live by our word. The actual wording here is something like, your words should be yes, yes, no, no. There's kind of this repetition. And what's going on there is instead of saying like, yes, I swear, all you have is your yes. And so if somebody says, do you really mean it? All you can do is repeat your yes, right? It's yes, and they say, really? And you say, yes. That's it. Jesus is saying, are you going to stand on your yes or your no? That's why some translations will say, let your yes be yes or your no be no. This translation says, let your answer, let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. If your word is not enough, it implies something about your motives, right? That maybe your motives aren't actually true. Maybe you're animated more by a desire to get what you want than a desire to actually do what you say, to actually live truthfully. The commentator I was reading on this passage put it this way: the challenge here in this passage is to stand as far as one's word is concerned, nakedly on one's own integrity. Nothing by which I might swear can be made to carry responsibility for my truthfulness. The responsibility is my own. So I'm not going to drag God into it and blame him if I don't follow through on what I said. It's up to me to live by my word. And so it's worthwhile when we come to a passage like this that we pause and ask ourselves those hard questions like, who bears responsibility for the truthfulness of my words? Who bears responsibility for the truthfulness of your words? Do you take responsibility for what you say? Or are words just tools to be used in the getting of what you want? Do you take your words seriously? Do others view you as a person who can be trusted to follow through? Or are you just another sort of boy who cried wolf, so to speak? And so your promises are met with, well, I'll believe it when I see it. Is that what people think of when they think of you? Yeah, I'll believe it when I see it. Or do they know that they can take it to the bank, so to speak? When you say you're going to do something, when you give your word, that you will follow through. That your word actually expresses what is true of your intentions. It's a pretty simple concept here. When Jesus talks about don't swear an oath by heaven or earth or whatever, but live by your word. It's a pretty simple concept. It's not necessarily easy, right? Just because something is simple to understand doesn't make it always easy to live out. Because there are plenty of temptations to go back on our word. There are plenty of temptations to say something that's not technically a lie, but it's not really true either. Just because we're trying to get out of an awkward social situation, or we're trying not to offend somebody or whatever. There's all kinds of ways in which we can be tempted not to be a person of our word. And just by the way, as an aside here, because I know some Christians have taken this passage to mean that you're not allowed to serve as a witness in a court of law because you're required to swear, right? You do solemnly swear that you will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. They used to say, "So help you God." I'm not sure they still say that anymore. That's not what Jesus is getting at here. He's not talking about the legal system and how, again, it's about your lifestyle, not necessarily just the words that you're saying, okay? When I worked for a summer at the Postal Service, I had to be sworn in as an employee of the U.S. government. How exciting was that? But that wasn't, I wasn't like thinking about this passion being like, oh no! I can't swear an oath. No, Jesus is saying live in such a way that people don't need you to add any weight to your promises. The Old Testament law outlined how wrong it is to swear oaths to God and to others that you don't intend to keep. And Jesus points us to the heart of the issue, showing how our lives should be characterized by following through in our word, on our word, to the extent that swearing oaths isn't even necessary. All that's needed is a simple yes or no, leaving others with no doubt of our intention to follow through. So I want to get practical here. What does it look like to pursue being people of our word? What do we do with this? One of the first applications that came to my mind as I was thinking about what does this look like, how do we pursue this goal, is that we need to refuse to use promises or even threats, kind of the negative side of a promise, for manipulation. Ask yourself the question, are my promises just tools to get others to do what I want? Or are they binding commitments on myself to be a blessing to the one that I'm making a promise to? Am I just trying to manipulate the situation or the person to get what I want, and I'll use whatever words I need to do it? Or am I truly seeking to commit in what I say, to be honest and straightforward in what I say? One example is of course in parenting, right? It's like promising the kid, you'll sometimes see a parent in a grocery store like, oh, I'll get you this if you're good, whatever. Like, are you actually going to follow through with that or not? If you're threatening some kind of punishment for your child if they don't obey, do you actually follow through on that? I'm preaching to myself here because this is going to be more and more of an issue as Milo's sin nature becomes more and more apparent in the years to come. Are you just trying to manipulate, or are you actually saying what is true, saying what you mean? And that's kind of the bleeds into the second thought that I had here, which is to seek to convey your true motives. If our words, our promises, or even threats are not to be used just to manipulate with no intention of actually following through, then what should our words be doing? They should be seeking to convey what we actually mean. Don't tell the truth in such a way that others are misled. Like Pinocchio. Well, I don't know where he's not. Right? Being a person of your word is about trying to convey to others what you actually mean. It's not just technically avoiding lying. We've got to be careful when we walk that line. Like, I'm more concerned here about just like not lying than actually conveying what I mean. And then finally, another thought that came to my mind is just simply to refuse to bail out. When you've made a commitment, refuse to bail out. Maybe you've made a commitment to a program, a volunteer position, an event, church thing or non-church thing. But now something more attractive has come along. Some other event that looks even better has come along. Will you keep your word? Maybe you've made a commitment to something or to someone, and it's turning out to be a lot harder than you anticipated. Maybe it's a commitment within your marriage. You've committed to say, for in sickness and in health, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, until death do us part, but didn't realize it was going to involve all this. Will you keep your word? Will you back out when the going gets tough? Makes me think of Psalm 15. Psalm 15 says, O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent? Who shall dwell on your holy hill? Who is going to be worthy of being part of God's kingdom? And the psalmist answers it this way: he who walks blamelessly and does what is right and speaks truth in his heart. So speaking the truth even to yourself within your heart, who does not slander with his tongue and does no evil to his neighbor, nor takes up a reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but who honors those who fear the Lord. And then listen to this: who swears to his own hurt and does not change. The NIV puts it as, who keeps his word even when it hurts. Doesn't back out and bail out when the going gets tough. The psalm ends with, he who does these things shall never be moved. This is the kind of person God is seeking to build us into. A person who is in the image of Jesus Christ. Because Jesus Christ is the ultimate one who kept his word even when it hurt, right? He went all the way to the cross, died in our place. He said, I only do what the Father tells me to do, and he kept that word. He was true to that word. He did what the Father desired. He willingly went to the cross. And by the way, I just need to point out, when I talk about refusing to bail out, I'm not saying that it's always wrong to quit a job or to step down from a church committee. Like, church committees are not a lifetime sentence, okay? Please hear that. You're welcome to step back from those kinds of things. There are many good reasons to back away from commitments, but the question is, what is your general practice in life? And I keep going back to that question of reputation. What is your reputation among others? Because that generally speaks to sort of the general tenure of your life, right? The kind of reputation that you have generally speaks to not just your intentions, what you intend to do, but what you actually do. People see what we actually do. They don't always see our intentions. So what reputation do you have? A reputation of being trustworthy and dependable, or a reputation of flaking out, failing to follow through on what you said you would do? And keep in mind that the reputation that you have with others is tied to the reputation of Christ. When people look at you as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, they're gauging how trustworthy and dependable Jesus is based on your example. You are the hands and feet, the mouthpiece of Christ in this world. And so this is a big deal. I've got friends that have a hard time trusting God because they've had Christian, especially Christian father figures in their life that did not display God's love and justice and all those things well in their life. And so when they think of God, all they can think of is that person who was supposed to be reflecting God to them and did a really poor job of it. Will we break that cycle or not? Let's be people of our word. I'm not going to keep preaching because, like I said, it's a simple concept, not easy to do. With God's gracious empowerment, though, we can do it. So let's do it. Let me pray. Father, would you work in us, empower us by your Holy Spirit to keep your word, to keep our word as well, to be people of our word, that we would actually live out the things that we say, that we would not use words or our word as a tool for manipulation, for getting what we want, but that we would use words, that we would use our word as a tool to convey to others what is truly in our heart. Even when we have to say hard things, Lord, we know we can speak the truth in love. Help us, Lord, to say the hard things that we need to say sometimes, to say it in a loving way, in a way that honors you and gives grace to those who hear. We need your help, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen.